Time to start another conversation with Silas Rossi.
Here we
Silas, how are
are.
you doing? Yeah, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And yeah, this is a big topic for us, or a big topic in general. And yeah, the topic today is habits. And I know it's something you've spent a fair amount of your life thinking about and developing, both on a personal level, but on a professional level too. And I'm I don't want to say I'm newer to the game because habits are certainly universal. We all develop habits throughout our lives, whether they're conscious or unconscious, or positive or negative. But in terms of thinking about this with that actual terminology, habits in the context of mountain craft, whether it's recreational travel or guiding, is a little bit newer. Um, we kind of mentioned that earlier, like the actual term habits is a little bit more all encompassing than some of the other terms that might fall underneath that umbrella. Um, so, Silas, on that note, I just thought maybe we should just start off with this the question like, what does a habit mean to you? Like, what does that term mean as you see it now?
Yeah, totally. Habits for me, yeah, like you said, is a relatively new term or new to me term that I've been using more and more. And it kind of encompasses like a bunch of things. For many, many years, I've tried to organize my thoughts and like how I do things and how I teach things into like these systems, right? And the systematic approach of like organizing things in a progression and being able to systemize what we're doing in the field has been like my approach to climbing and teaching. And so I was using this word systems for a while and systemization. And then I was focusing a lot after like that little like kind of bunch of years into like more patterns and like how we recreate the same patterns over and over again. And this idea of pattern recognition being a big topic and in just the ability to have these things replay in different scenarios, but in a similar way. And then I started thinking about it in terms of habits. And I think that habits encompasses all of these things. So systems, systems like kind of a conceptual idea of looking at things and just these the whole topic to me now is habits, just like patterns and systemization of what we're doing in the field. So they can be conscious, they can be subconscious. We all have these patterns and habits that we do. And so that for me is where this whole conversation has been going. And I'm pretty excited to like dive into kind of the weeds with this one for sure. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is like developing these ways of thinking and developing and being active and trying to develop habits gives us a lot of benefits in the field. Um, and some of those benefits are safety benefits, but some of those benefits are just efficiency or fun, and just ways of kind of being, which I think are really interesting. For some reason, I keep gravitating back towards systems of thinking and habits of based around more safety, but maybe because that's we spend so much of our time thinking about hazards and risks and how do we recognize hazards and risks and how do we employ systems to deal with that. But I think that it is kind of more encompassing than just that piece. Um, for example, like being at a transition, do you have a specific habit that you do at a transition? Let's just say belaying somebody up or two people up, and now how are we going to connect them into the anchor, right? Before we redo all of our ropes and take off on another pitch. Like there's definitely some great habits you can develop around a spot like that versus having no habits, for example. So,
Yeah, totally. I mean, we all have these habits, right? And whether it's getting in the car and putting our seatbelt on, or waking up in the morning and making coffee, like we have these patterns and habits that we do oftentimes without thinking to some extent, and that's true in climbing and guiding as well. And I guess I think you and I have been very thoughtful and have approached like the curriculum we've been teaching uh, in a very organized way. But I think the reality is that for most people and most climbers, they probably have a lot of habits. They of course have a lot of habits, some that they realize and some they don't. And I think my idea with this whole like systemization and conceptualization of ideas and concepts is that we introduce people to, I'm going to use the word best as I have no other better way to say it, these best practices, these best habits and best patterns to be doing in the field as a way of being not only safer, but also more productive. And almost all the time in climbing, you have to trade safety for security, right? And I think if we focus on designing these habits and procedures really well, we actually can have a benefit in both. And so if I think about my time like guiding the Tetons many years ago, there were a lot of really old school guides there that knew the mountain really well and could travel pretty quickly and pretty efficiently, but oftentimes without as much security as I wanted. So my whole goal there was to both be as fast as they were, which I wasn't at first, but also offer more security. And I think that concept plays through to a lot of climbing and guiding in general. Is like, if you're more savvy, you actually can be safer and faster or more efficient or more productive than most climbers and guides out there. And it comes from being thoughtful and having this idea of being like a safe, productive climber from the beginning. Like it's a mindset to start with, right? So that's where my brain goes as a kind of like a big picture concept with this whole idea.
Yeah, I've always thought that, and I oftentimes make the comment like the reason why I spend a lot of time getting good at the skills in this field is so I don't have to cut corners, right? Because I'm fast enough with doing things well that cutting the corners is just dumb and not worth it. And oftentimes cutting the corners, eventually it catches up with you. So it's like just get really good at the skills and have this mindset and develop these systems which become habits. So now it's like it's no big deal to do whatever. You're going to be just as fast, if not faster, and move more safely than the person next to you who doesn't have these systems and habits in place. And that's really important to me. Now we're in the money, right? It's like if I can move more efficiently and be safer, it's just win-win. And I think that's where this comes really important. These concepts.
Yeah, and so for me, like having that like attitude or mantra, like I'm a climber who climbs safely or is savvy or whatever like you want that mantra to be, is a good place to start. And then like this whole idea that these ideas that you and I have like been thinking about for 25 years about like, okay, like what are the best systems and habits that we can impose on people and teach people to set them up well for success through their whole career, right? Like, I mean, like closing the rope system is a really obvious, great example now that you and I were not taught early on in our career. But after a certain amount of time doing this and thinking about it, it's like very clear that we should probably, like, the habit should be a conservative habit that works every time and that frees up bandwidth and covers your butt for when you do make a mistake, which is inevitable at some point. And then if that habit is like automatic and you just close the rope system, say on rappelling, and you tie knots every time, you can always make a more aggressive choice, of course, right? But it's a conscious choice. And the automatic default when you're stressed or tired or the weather is bad is to have that more conservative habit in place already. So you don't have to think about it as quickly. And I think it takes a long time to develop the discipline to create those habits early on. And the idea, I think, with the concepts that you and I have taught and are teaching now, I think the idea is that we give these concepts early on in the career that are good habits and will follow someone and evolve with them as they develop and get better and better and better, and not just dead end in, like, say, single pitch terrain or in cragging terrain. Like, those concepts can grow and get more nuanced as people get more proficient and skilled. But at least that habit's a baseline function that covers our butts in a default kind of setting.
Yeah, I definitely think that's pretty important. Just like you mentioned, when we add stress into these situations, and you will, when you're guiding, you're always going to have stressors from one way or another, even just on a normal day, let alone some more of negative event happening. But as soon as you add stress in, it kind of breaks us apart. So having great habits, and especially ones that lean towards conservative decisions, just really, like you said, it covers your butt in those stressful situations when you're more apt to miss something. So it's kind of interesting. I also think, this topic is pretty expansive. It's not just like I do this sequence as a habit. It's like I'm in this stressful situation, so my habit is to slow down. It's to take a deep breath. So it can be in every aspect of what we do in our work, but also in life, which I think is interesting. But Silas, actually, let's just talk about like habit formation, like kind of like the pieces of like, okay, so we want to develop certain practices or habits in our work or our life. We'll just keep it in the guiding and climbing and skiing context. But what are some like ways to start easing into that? Like you said, we've introduced that, but habits are tricky because we want them to stick, right? And we want to always do them. So what are some of your thoughts about how we can kind of get into that process of developing new habits that will stick and be useful for us?
Of developing habits that stick, yeah. Great question. I think, you and I have read this book called Atomic Habits, which is a really great resource. I'm actually rereading it again currently. It's an amazing resource, and one of the big things that they advocate in that book is just making it simple, right? It's like having a system in place to facilitate the habit. So I'm 40 years old now, and I didn't basically work out for my entire life until like 5 years ago. And the impetus to start working out when I was 35 was that I got in a bike accident, right? So I crashed my mountain bike and got pretty hurt, broke my scapula, a couple ribs, a couple vertebrae, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to climb ever again. So I spent 2 months like basically on the couch with my arm in a sling and recovering and just chilling out all summer. And during that summer, I was motivated. I knew that I had to like come back into shape, right? That started with physical therapy. And so I just started building a home gym because I've tried to go to the gym before and it just doesn't work for me. Like I can't find the time, even though the gym is relatively close to me, I can't find the time to plan to actually make the trip to the gym, spend an hour to the gym, and then come back. So I built this home gym, and that home gym was one of the keys to making it easy and systemized for me to start working out regularly. The other part was just hiring a personal trainer, which was huge. So I didn't have to worry about like actually creating my plan, but I had a plan that was there in place that I could just do. So I think it has to be, for one, it has to be easy to do and it makes sense and not take a lot of thought and preparation time or whatever you don't have much of to do. And I think the other part has to be that it's fun and rewarding, right? So yeah, those are the two pieces that stick to my mind right away. How about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Like if it's not simple, you're not going to do it, right? And I think that piece is pretty huge. And the fact that you get positive feedback from that process is also pretty huge. So it's, I'm also rereading Atomic Habits right now, ironically, and taking away more thoughts from that. But yeah, if anybody can like do something once, but for it to stick as a habit is really challenging. So if the barrier to entry is too high, then you're not going to do it. So I think the other really big thing I think that's important in this whole process, and actually what they highlight in that book, which I think is important, is like we're not trying to like change major things all at once. we're trying to change small things, little 1% things that we just do every time. And it's a lot more manageable to do that in these small steps. And that it's the accumulation of these small changes that become habits that ultimately affect us in a really positive way. It could be like we're rappelling, it's dark, we've been out all day, storms coming in, and we have this habit built in and we miss the catastrophic event because we've built in this little habit that's a 1% thing that all of a sudden plays out in this one scenario, right? I think that's the big takeaway. And also the other big takeaway for me is like, it's not so much about the outcome driven, it's about the process of of developing these habits and how enjoying that process of doing these things versus necessarily the outcome. Like the process of doing a really full partner check is more important to me in some ways than the outcome. Like the outcome is important too, but I really, really appreciate the connection that doing that partner check does to me and my other person on the other end of the rope, and how we kind of get another check on our system and kind of bring us closer together in some ways. So that process is really important, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a really great quote. There are several very great quotes from that book, but one is reliable solutions to recurring problems. And so I've heard it said that the things that you like, if you spend some money or time investing in something in your life, you're probably more likely to enjoy something that you find solves a problem for you as opposed to being additive to your life, right? So if you what's a good example? Well, say you, well, I can't think of a great example off the top of my head. Maybe oh boy, under the gun here. Let's keep going with that for a minute. But basically, if you just add great things to your life, that'll be less satisfying than solving a bigger problem in your life, right? So for me, like, cool, like I'd love to climb harder. That was always something I wanted to do over my years climbing and guiding. But that wasn't enough motivation in and of itself just to start a workout routine, which I knew would get me there, right? As opposed to, well, I have this problem where I have a broken scapula and I'm not going to be able to ever climb again until I get this routine in place. Like that was the impetus for me to start working out again. Like I wasn't going to be able to do my work ever again if I didn't take a pragmatic and proactive approach to working out and getting stronger and rehabilitating. So that's one quote I like a lot. Reliable solutions to recurring problems, because we have these things that happen in our lives all the time, daily, weekly, monthly, that are issues and are a total pain in the butt and are a source of frustration or lack of motivation. Or in climbing, big accidents, right? Like closing the rope system on rappel is a great habit, reliable solution to a recurring problem, which is people wrap off the end of the ropes all the time, right? And the same is true for tying the knot in the end of a rope on single pitch terrain, because people lower off, and if the rope's too short for the pitch, they get lowered off in the rope all the time. So reliable solution, again, is to close the rope system to a recurring problem, which is the rope is too darn short for whatever you're trying to do with it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the other part that kind of goes with this in terms of like habit formation that I thought was out of this book and that I thought was really powerful is like not focusing on what you want, but who you want to be in terms of like, like you said, I want to get stronger. Okay, well, I always say that too, but then it's kind of like this amorphous, loose topic versus now I'm on the same train with like the fitnessing. Like I hired a trainer and like just who I want to be now is different than when I was a year ago with my trainer. And now I have this habit of doing my workouts every time. Like I almost never miss a workout, and it's just become part of me. And it's way easier to keep that habit of an excitement about working out and like, all right, now I can get to the next step. So make it harder for me for this next phase. And now I can have more of a goal of where I want to be. So I think, you can't just have a blanket, I want this to happen. You have to actually decide, like, I want to be the person who does this. So I want to be the person who always does a partner check, right? Or always does a trailhead beacon check. I always want to do that. And that's ultimately the root of the change, versus just trying to have an outcome that you're trying to shoot for. That's a lot harder to stay true to that course with habit formation.
I think you're absolutely right, for sure. Yeah, like we often think about like Western civilization is this mindset of like, cool, like once I have this thing, I'll be able to do this, and then I'll be whatever, be happy, be satisfied, right? Like we kind of move from like have, do, be. And I would encourage folks to actually flip that around. And just to your point, like if we start with the be, right? Like be, like I am a climber who is smart and takes time where I need it. Or I think in our case, a lot of times it's like, I am a professional mountain guide. Like I take this job seriously and I don't cut corners. I do the best job I possibly can, et cetera, right? So if we can embody whatever you are interested in becoming as a person, like what does this type person do in this case? Like how do I act? How do I behave? Behave. How do I behave as a person in this moment? That will bleed into, okay, well, this type of person that is brave and takes calculated risks would do this. So once I have the embodiment of this idea of how to behave, that trends into the practices I will do. Like if I'm a professional mountain guide, like I do system checks and I communicate well with my clients, right? If I'm a smart, savvy climber who takes calculated risks, then I do the same thing, like systematic checks. I close the system on my ropes whenever possible. And it takes discipline to create that behavior, right? So behave, do, and then if you do those things, you will have, in our case, a safer, more productive, fun experience. I'm pretty convinced. So like we create the reality we want, right? But I think in that category, in that direction, so be, do, have really is what we want to shoot for, and not just the, like I often said, like, man, if I had 5 pounds of muscle on my upper body, I'd be totally unstoppable as a climber. I mean, not an untrue statement, but that's as far as it ever went, right? Like just having 5 pounds of muscle in my upper body wasn't enough to create these habits to be this person. Like I had to turn it around, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge topic. I mean, it's interesting watching a lot of newer guides coming into this, and there's people are so wrapped up sometimes with learning all this stuff. There's so much stuff to know. It's so overwhelming, and realistically, the development of some very basic, simple habits goes a lot longer and a lot further than trying to like figure out all this other stuff. Like all that stuff comes in time, but like, just the acts of like locking your carabiners, right? That habit of like finish this task before you move on. I'm a guy who finishes the task before I move on to the next one. Like those are such powerful tools. And it's interesting, like how this is like for both of us coming to us after years of trying to be good at this, and all of a sudden now we're like, oh, we're like more fully realizing these patterns and these habits and the power that they give us, and partially being able to articulate it. And I think that's really, really important. And it's a hard, I think it's a relatively hard thing to pass on, in my experience, to a younger generation or a newer generation of guides in particular, or even recreational climbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many new things all at once for us at that stage, right? Like everything is new and everything's a variable. So you're literally trying to figure out what's important. And when everything's important, then you can't focus on anything because you're trying to have this like diffused attention to every single detail, which I think is why this is so valuable to me at this point in my teaching and instruction, is that like it's like I want to grab someone and be like, look, I have the answer that you're looking for, and it's these like 10 habits. I promise you. And if you can develop the discipline to just practice these 10 habits, man, your career is going to be freaking awesome. like that's how I feel right now. And I wish that someone had done that for me. I mean, you and I had great mentorship, but I think when I think back now, like I think that because we had that great mentorship, that this is actually a step beyond the level of I don't know what the right word is, polish, if you will, in the education that we were getting. Like everything we got was great, and man, if we had been given like these 10, like this list of 10 things that I have in mind, I think it would just be such a huge step forward. And as we think about like, you know, like this whole like gym to crag mentality is really big, or rock climbers going into the mountains, like I have those 10 things that I want to give like each of those demographics of people to focus on moving forward. And yeah, I guess I don't know, it's so it's like it's everything to me right now. Like it's like my whole career boiled up into like these like bullet points, which is kind of crazy to think about. um
Yeah. So Silas, do you have a couple that you want to share?
well, I could share a couple. Yeah.
Just a couple, and not all 10.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, not to keep blabbing about nothing, but you know, I think like I spent personally like I don't know, like I spent like 15 years, at least 10 to 12 years, trying to not do things the same way. Like that was instilled pretty early on, like Canadian Mountain Guides was like, cool, like if you're, I mean, and the point was good, right? Like don't be complacent. So do things differently than you did before, to create more proficiency and more well-roundedness. So I think that people that are early on in their climbing careers and guiding careers need to do that as well. Like we need to be really well versed in an enormous variety of techniques, and proficiencies, while also not losing sight of the core principles that I think are these fundamental habits. So I literally spent like 10 years trying to go as fast as possible and develop new skills here and there, to create this like huge like foundation, or yeah, foundation to build from for any situation across the board in any environment, at any time with any people, that I could just pick and play like the right tool for the right time. And now after doing that for so long, I've kind of like come back to the core. And I think that you and I are only able to do that because we explored so much. Like you have to go explore to find out what for you is the real core of the issue here. And the reality, honestly, is that most people, most climbers or guides, just aren't going to spend as much time as you and I have going through these practices and thinking about these things as critically, to get it boiled down to the basics that I think I've, at least for myself, I've gotten to. And that probably sounds like I'm bragging a little bit. I'm really not. Like I just think it's like a critical mass of time that has to get put in to get things back to that simplicity. Because when you start out, things are super simple. As you grow, they get really complex and complicated. And then, you know, at some point, hopefully they again get really simple, and you can be, like we said, more productive and faster and safer all at the same time. And I want to help people shortcut the 22 years it's taken me to get to this point by giving them some simple criteria, some simple habits that'll serve them well and be safe and productive, in the field. So.
I mean, you essentially just wrote several chapters of my book. That is like verbatim what I think about now. Yeah, I mean, that was really just a synthesis of kind of my experiences over the last couple of decades as well, since we had such a similar kind of foundational interactions, with John and Katie Mountain Guides. So, Silas, it looks like we're running out of time. I want to stop this and I want to reboot this so we can kind of continue. And I'll give us a second just to chill our brains out and continue this conversation. Sound good?
That sounds excellent.
All right. Or we'll be back in a second. Okay. I think we're recording now too on my end. I hope so. Anyway, Silas, I wanted to kind of start where you left off, this whole concept of how you and I both explored a lot for a very large part of our careers. And, things were simple when you don't know a lot, and then they get really complex when you know more stuff. And then you get to a point where things become simple again, hopefully. And one of the things I hadn't really appreciated until the last couple of years, especially with this habit formation piece, is how much stress reduction there is when you actually have these habits and can gravitate towards simpler processes again. So like when I was younger, I didn't really think about this. I was able to kind of keep all these things in my head at the same time while I was guiding, kind of is a lot more amorphous and kind of could flow. And I think realistically, my ability to process that data and manage it all was not really as good as I thought. It's just you're young and you think you can do that. And now I find so much comfort in like just reeling it in and being able to like, just, this is my habit here on this transition. This is what I do. And having this kind of like, I guess, relatively precise habit, let's just say at a transition, for example, allows me just to free up my mind to focus on some other details, some more subtle details. So the polish, like you mentioned. So maybe more of the client experience, because I don't have to like constantly like, all right, well, if I do this and I do this, it's like, no, I'm just going to do this thing. Like my transitions become more and more simple. Like I don't do lots of varied transitions anymore. I tend to use one or two simple transitions that work universally and couple that with getting really good at them so they're just as fast as I want them to be, versus when I was younger, I would do ones that were maybe more amorphous or on the fly that I thought kind of would flow well. But now I'm like, I don't even want to do with that. And the habit allows me to not have to worry about figuring out if the transition is going to work or not. It's like, it just works every time. And now I don't have to put that energy towards that. So I think that's another place where developing good habits throughout, especially through critical transition points. I think when we're doing something and it's relatively stable, right? Whether it's like you're in the climbing mode or you're in skiing mode, like you don't have to worry about too much stuff there. But when we actually have positions where we're going to transition to something else, whether that's in a technical system, making a corner on a skin track or something, that's where these habits can really, really benefit us a lot, because now we're just doing things almost automatically to be as efficient as possible and as safe as possible. So we can actually free up our bandwidth to do other bigger conceptual things that we're trying to do with the day guiding, which I think is really important.
I think a huge part of that, and I totally agree, I think a huge part of that is that every system or technique has some sort of downfall, like it has an Achilles heel. And if you're trying something new, you have to, and especially in a guiding context, of course, not only do it correctly, but also understand beforehand what the Achilles heel of this sequence or transition is. And so you have to think it through enough to realize, and oftentimes I think people actually don't, but run into the Achilles heel or downfall too late, and then have to problem solve for that Achilles heel, right? So if you know a system or transition or sequence well enough to know it inside and out and address all the concerns beforehand, boy, you're winning, right? And I think you and I are kind of, again, like for the average recreational climber, or a person starting out climbing at least, like we're on the opposite end of the equation, right? Like for a lot of folks, they actually probably should develop like 2 or 3 ways of doing something, not just the one way they've always done something, the one habit every single time. And then for guides, I think it's probably a bit of a mixture of like, learning 2 or 3 ways to do something, but also at the same time keeping in perspective like these foundational kind of habits as well. So it's just interesting because you want to have both, right? You want to have all the experience and expertise and diversity of application of skills, but also at the same time not need to ever use them.
Yeah, I mean, we have an incredibly challenging job in terms of just that breadth of skills and depth of skills. And, I know that certainly exploring as much as I have has allowed me to be more dynamic in my guiding, especially now. I just have more to offer. And I can be more selective when I pick and choose something that's going to be more novel, and just stick to more tried and true methods, which are really good. But one thing I think that's also interesting about habits, and it's what's coming to my mind right now, is like the habits that we might develop around certain transition points, all ultimately to kind of have a safety piece, is like when a habit becomes too ingrained and too automatic, what can happen is we can start missing things, because all of a sudden our brain wants to see what we want to see. So did we really check something? Like, oh, we did the habit, we checked, but did we really see what we wanted to see? Is that not really correct? Is the buckle really done? Is the carabiner really locked? And I think that's a place where when habits are too ingrained, we got to be a little bit more careful too. So like, I know that I specifically do a lot with like verbalizing and even pointing at things, like when I'm doing like a partner check. So I'm like, all right, so I'm actually externally processing this piece, even though I've internally processed it, but to just make sure I've done due diligence and doing the habit well. Because we can have a good habit in place, but if we don't do the habit well, then it's kind of irrelevant. And I think that's, once again, as I get older, like it's just a more conservative approach of dealing with this, is going through these things and verbally. And also I think in terms of just clients understand that you're actually checking the system as well. So it's not like they think he's not looking at anything, or they're not looking at anything rather. It's like they actually see that you're doing due diligence. And I think that's a really important piece with this habit thing, is understand when they become a little too automatic. We need to be a little more conscious and have a little bit more intent and intention with them to keep them really fresh and crisp, because we ultimately want them to do what we want them to do, which I think is important.
It's a great point. Like I tend to, the way my brain works and my personality, like I tend to want to figure out the best way to do something, like and the extreme of that is like black and white, right, wrong, yes, no, right? But like I try to figure out like the best way to do something, and that's a really great place to start as your habit. Like we said, conservative, efficient, and to your point, be flexible enough when you need to be, to easily step out of that habit and make a different choice. So it's easy to go too far either direction and be like kind of like this right brain, like artistic person who's like, it's always different and always fun and creative, like on one hand. And on the other hand, like too left brain, pragmatic, like dogmatic, this is the way I do this every time. And the best of the habits is to blend those two. Like you have a baseline operating way of doing something, and then you can be creative when you want to or need to. So, I mean, the knots in the end of the rappel rope is such a great example. I keep coming back to it, but it's like, do I always, every single time, forever tie knots in the end of my rappel rope? No, but my default setting is to do that now, which has taken me a long time to do. But I make a conscious choice to be more aggressive and not tying the knots in the rope certain times, like i.e. one pitch off the ground and maybe I see for sure both ends of the rope are on the ground, right? So that's just one thing that I often think about, is trying to blend those two things and not be too stuck in your way of whichever way it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the concept of how structure creates freedom, right? So it's like if we don't have the structure of these habits, which at first kind of seems like it boxes you in, right? But then it ultimately creates freedom. I think about like painters or musicians, like when they know the actual skills of painting and all the different styles, and they know how music is actually put together, then you have the freedom to create whatever you want, and you're not just kind of like applying something randomly, for example. Sometimes random, like sometimes people can apply things randomly and it's totally intuitive to them and it is something beautiful and it is something profound. But I know for me, like having the structure of good habits gives me the freedom to do whatever I want. So that could be the habit of getting really fit, and now I can just go climb or ski the way I want to. Yay, awesome. Or that could be the structure of a technical transition, and now I can, have the freedom to do whatever else I want, which is kind of interesting.
So in that line, I think you're spot on. In that line, I'm really curious. So I often think about like these habits not being maybe necessary all the time for like day to day when it's easy, but oftentimes developing that habit well enough that when things do get hard, or out of the norm, like it's dark, it's windy, it's stormy, someone's hurt. Like I think about the habits being really coming into their own in those scenarios when things get really hard or extreme. So I'm curious if you have habits that you think really set you up well or serve you well in a climbing or guiding scenario, in that context, that may be like small mundane habits that really set you up well for success when things do, hopefully not ever again, go sideways.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think the concept of slowing down and verbalizing, like, we're going to slow down here. We need to kind of take our time through here is a really big one. And verbalizing kind of like if we're doing something technical, the links in the chain to make sure that we are actually getting all the links dialed in because we're under this stressor. I know, to be honest, a real big one for me is stick with the plan. Like this was my descent plan to do this. I'm doing that because I've actually gotten burnt pretty hard being like, oh, I'm a mountain guide. I've got all these skills. Let's go down this way. I can figure that out. And like, ultimately we got there, but I'm like, that wasn't the way to go,
Yeah, totally.
So like just being the habit of like, when this is a great example, like in ski touring, you do all your pre-trip planning, which partly is where I will go and where I won't go. And the habit is to be true to that in the field. And like, all right, I got to hear this isn't good. I'm going to descend this way back my track because that's a known quantity versus, oh, this looks kind of good here, but I kind of said I wasn't going to go there today. That itself has been really powerful. Like you made these decisions ahead of time. So you're trying to remove your emotional connection with them in the field. And now the habit is just to do them.
Yeah, totally.
Like, even though you might think you could get away with it, it's like, nope, that's not how this works. And
like your plan literally was sussed out to help you avoid that scenario in the field.
Correct. Correct. So I'm way more diligent with that habit now. Like, this is how I'm going to descend. Yep.
I totally agree. I think one aspect that we often undervalue creating accidents is exactly that. Like a lot of accidents happen from the plan changing and not being set up for the change in plan. I think it's super undervalued, and technical rock climbing is an easy example because it's so concrete. I think your skiing example is really good too, but like, you're at a single pitch crag, right? And your partner's going to lead the pitch, and that the anchors, this climb, right? The pitch is a 80-foot pitch. 60-meter rope easily makes it when they lower from the chains. And then, so you're like, oh, we don't need a knot in the rope today. They get to the 80-foot chains, right? And something changes. Either a party's wrapping down and they can't stop there, or it's clogged up, or maybe it's a spot that the guidebook says is 80 feet, but the anchor is kind of crap. So you have to like traverse out to another anchor and then lower off, like some kind of change in plan. And then all of a sudden that lack of knot in the rope, which you knew worked for your plan, now doesn't work because of a simple change in plan. That's a great one. Nice.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right on. People change their plans, and the strategy that they employ for their first plan doesn't work for the second one.
Because you can't think it through in the field as well, right?
No.
Like you're prepping at home so that you have the bandwidth and time to like plan things really well.
Yeah,
Uh,
so it's like you're managing uncertainty, right? And having these good conservative habits helps you manage the uncertainty, right? Like you said, you can always step up and have a more aggressive choice, but you got to start with the conservative choice that you know will work, right? It's like they may
totally.
not get to the ground, but at least they're not going to hit the ground if there's a knot in the rope, right?
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
that's more important. It's another problem to solve, but it's a better problem to solve.
Yeah.
So
I have a good friend in the Tetons probably 10 years ago that was guiding a client and on the middle Teton, and they had a plan to go up the normal route on the south side, and they got pretty close and looked up this like beautiful snow couloir to a rock ridge, and they're like, just kind of on a whim, they're like, oh, we're making pretty good time, like the normal route's kind of boring, let's go up here. And that backfired so hard that they got like benighted and were coming down the peak in the dark, and it was like it's actually like pretty dangerous, and was a pretty rugged experience for the client and the guide for sure. Just a simple like, to your point, like, oh, like we had a plan, but this looks awesome, this looks pretty good, I can do that. I'm good
yeah,
enough. Yeah.
yeah. When you're good enough, you don't make that choice.
Totally.
I mean, we've all done it. I mean, I'm
We
not saying
have.
I haven't done it, but now I'm like, I'm not doing that.
Totally.
I think about that all the time.
Is there one habit that you use? um I keep going back to climbing because it's like climbing season right now, but like rock climbing, that you would, we've talked about obviously closing the rope system, but is there one habit beside that that you would recommend or highly recommend to folks, either guiding or climbing recreationally, that you think is kind of like where it's at?
Well, I mean, it's that's this one kind of encompasses a lot of things, and it's finish the task,
Nice.
right? So it's like don't move forward to the next task until the one that you're doing is finished. So I think that encompasses a lot of things. That encompasses a really thorough partner check all the way through every time, right? Checking the buckles, checking the knots, checking we're in the hard point, checking the ends closed, checking the belay setup, and like locking carabiners, like lock the carabiner, right?
Yeah.
I think just that piece of like finish where you are now, and then you can move forward to the next piece is one of the bigger things that you can do, and not miss stuff. So that's where I see people kind of miss. They want to jump ahead for whatever reason, and all of a sudden now they've opened themselves up to risk for no reason.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
and it's
It's almost,
oftentimes, well, I'd say oftentimes it's just a sequence change. Like people don't actually always have to add or subtract things from what they're doing. They just have to change the order in which they're doing and that habit alone. And it all of a sudden goes from like you just exposed yourself to this cliff edge and then you just reduced it by 50%, literally just by changing the sequence of events, not by
yeah,
anything else. And that's part
totally.
I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Nice. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Um, that's really good. I think of like a 1-2-1 sequencing a lot of times. Like, cool, you're secured by this thing. Let's add a new thing, and then the old thing comes off. Right? Like that's the sequencing part for me. But yeah, it's crazy. Like I think people like oftentimes like just don't have quite a fully baked vision of like a transition or a sequence, and they kind of get into it and like, oh, but this, oh, but that, and it's kind of like this like diffused awareness, as opposed to your point of like finishing, like do one thing, do it to completion, then do the next thing. Yeah, and I think you're pausing and like slowing down is probably the single biggest thing that someone can do to shortcut that.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting game. But I mean, I do think as much as we want to shortcut people's progression into this, there's still just time in the saddle and experimentation that people have to go through to develop the awareness and the knowledge of these different skills, but also like habits that kind of work for them. I mean, you could, like, we all have kind of unique, slightly different ways of accomplishing the same goals, which are still all acceptable. So you still kind of need that time in the saddle, which is important. But having the awareness of the fact that what habits can do for you, especially as you get into your career, is really important that you can implement now, even though you're just starting on this journey, which is super powerful. That, like you said, we didn't necessarily have.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the other one for me that keeps coming back, this big concept from both the rock climbing, but also like all the way through mountain climbing and guiding perspective, is being at the right place at the right time in the terrain. And that takes a lot of careful preparation and work beforehand. But man, if you can plan both in a macro sense and a micro sense of where to be when, things, and you nail it, things get pretty easy. And if you kind of miss it, things get really hard. And I think about that in like a seasonality kind of setting, like right time of year to be somewhere. Also like in the mountain range kind of idea, like week to week, based on weather and conditions, snow conditions, ice conditions, and even like time of day, right? If you hit the right time of day with spring corn cycle, it's going to be great. If you miss it, it's going to be pretty death defying. Or rock climbing in the sun, if you hit the shade, it's going to be pretty nice out there today. If you hit the sun, it's going to be pretty miserable. So the prep time, being in the right place at the right time, before just like showing up and going into the field, for me is another big one for sure.
Yeah, I like to add to that list, for the right reasons.
So what are the right reasons?
Well, I mean, you know, if you're in the right place at the right time for the right reasons, then I think now you're really in a position to launch. I mean, the right reasons is very subjective, right? We all have to make a decision of what those reasons are. But
what would be an example of a bad reason?
Well, I gave an example on an earlier episode where I had two choices of routes to lead. It's kind of like my last day of ice guiding, and one route was a little harder, more straight up and down. I kind of wanted to do it because whatever, and I ultimately chose the easier lead because it was a better route to follow, just because of the nature of how it kind of went up, and it was easier just to drop my client down on top of this harder route. And we were there for a very short period of time, and the reason for me to climb the harder line, even though I could have done it and I could have made the day work, was more based on my ego versus what really would flow really well with that morning. And that would actually just be the most efficient use of our time and actually put me at the least amount of risk. Especially it was like literally like my last morning of ice guiding for the season. I'm like, well, why don't we just soft pedal out of here? So I ultimately chose the easier line because I thought that was a better reason. So I was at the right place at the right time, but I actually had to make a choice. And that's also subjective too. Like if you can just climb that pitch and it's not a big deal, then there's maybe not really as much of a reason not to do it. But for me, that morning, it was not the right reason to climb that route.
Totally.
No, so that's
a ton of wisdom in there. That's awesome. Well, I don't have a ton more on this conversation, but I do think that we're all human, and the biggest thing that I keep coming back to in all of climbing and guiding is like things don't usually break. It's not usually some kind of like quote unquote act of God that's gonna like get us if anything does. It's just that we're gonna make a mistake. And it's either us making a mistake or our partners making a mistake. And I have really tried to think and be very thoughtful about creating systems and habits in place that back me up for that inevitable at some point in my career instance where the law of big numbers catches up with me, right? Like I've been really fortunate, honestly, knock on wood, to not have anything really bad happen in the field. And it's been a lot of hours out there. And I think at some point, I know at some point that the odds are stacked against us, right? So the longer I do this, and I think this is a point for younger folks too, is like the longer you do this, the more careful you have to be. And developing these habits early on that safeguard you against that human error piece is absolutely foundational. I've seen people wrap off in the ropes, hit the ground multiple times. I know you've responded to a lot of accidents in the field. I have too. And, like trying to figure out what problem you're trying to solve and how to safeguard ourselves against these human error pieces, I think is really huge and important.
Yeah, I like to think of dominoes and like kind of back to that 1% thing, like little dominoes, if you have enough of them, push over big dominoes, right? And there's always going to be that one scenario where all the things align, and that little domino is the keystone that holds the arch together, that one little piece. And if you don't have a good habit in place, or you let your guard down, or you don't do due diligence that one time, all of a sudden it gets you. So there's really no reason not to do it. And I guess I'm kind of running out of things, in terms of this conversation. But I do think a piece of this is just culture. And because I see so many people not necessarily doing a habit or playing it off, like think the classic thing, like you go to check somebody's knot and they're like, don't worry about it, I'm fine, I know how to tie my knot. It's like, I'm investing in you right now, right? Like, I want you to be safe. Like, of course I think you're a competent person, but we all make mistakes. So I think there's a lot of culture change that can be done around developing habits, but also just displaying those habits within a group. And I think as a guide, we are fortunate where we have a lot more structure baked into our training that kind of leads us down those paths. But just think about how many times you go skiing with a group of people, and you're going to do a partner check, and you learned how to do this very good, clean, precise partner check, but then they do it kind of like poorly, right, at the trailhead. And it's just like the culture is not supporting the habit. And I think that's also another piece that goes way beyond this conversation. But the more you can be with people who have like-minded cultures, right, that support these good habits, ultimately the better those teams are going to be in the pursuits that they're trying to do in the mountains.
Yes.
So I think choosing your partners well is always the key. Yeah, I mean, I'd much rather climb with somebody who is interested in checking my harness out versus just like, oh, I got this. Like, I'm like, all right, I don't want to climb with you. I don't care how good you are.
Yeah.
I'm done with you.
Yeah, I agree.
Because what else do you not check, right? So, but anyway, that's kind of some of my parting thoughts.
I think it's really great. Yeah, it's a huge topic for sure. I think to your point, like I think there are some, I guess I see it in a couple ways. Like there are a few habits like we talked about earlier that I think maybe people don't realize are as important as I think they are in the field. And that's an education piece that hopefully I can help. And I think this conversation is a really great place to start, like help impart on more people. And I think the other piece, just to your recent story, is that, man, once you know the habit is there and it's helpful for you, you've got to have the discipline to develop it and make it second nature. And that just takes work. Everyone wants the shortcut, but that's just going to take work no matter who you are. Like we can give you this, like we said, like list of 10 or 12 things that are, in my opinion, some of the best habits you can possibly have. But if you don't take that and run with it and actually develop it and make it your own, and systemize it, like what's the point of even having the information there, right? You have to make it your own. You have to put the time in no matter what, of making these habits actually affect the outcome of you in the field.
The interesting thing is the habit is the shortcut. Because now you're not processing all these variables. Like, I mean, you do have to do that to some degree, but you're like, all right, here's my habit. So I can free up that mind space for something else.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting.
Right. We've already given you the shortcut.
That's right.
Take it.
Take the shortcut. This is one shortcut you can take. So, well, Silas, on that note, we've certainly burned couple blocks of time pretty easily again. Yeah,
I love this topic. There's more on this that I'd like to dive into at some point, but I think we've talked about it plenty for today.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, on that note, let's call it a morning, and we'll get this out to the public and see what happens. Oh, by the way, you are 2 of our 3 talks, Silas Rossi talking about lead climbing with me, and then you also talking about shortening the rope, are like number 1 and 2 most listened episodes on my whole podcast. So rocketed right to the top. So
it's an honor. It's always fun to talk to you.
Oh, well, sometimes. All right. On that, we're gonna shut this down. So
thanks, dude.
All right, I'll talk to you later. Thank you.